everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about this unit. So in this unit, we're done with the Civil War. Reconstruction has ended. The issues haven't necessarily ended. But this unit, we're really going to focus on the United States at the turn of the century. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, America really modernizes. America moves forward for good or bad. For that reason, this is called America Progresses. There is a thing called the Progressive Era we're going to talk about in this unit. But America, methodically, like a steamroller, moves forward. For a lot of people in the United States, it's going to be beneficial. There's definitely some groups that do not benefit from America's progress. And we're going to try to touch on it all as best we can here in this unit. Let's go ahead and get started. So a lot of this unit is going to be talking about the factory workers, the immigrants, how the rich people started controlling everything in the late 1800s, and how the factory workers really stood up and started taking some of that power back. The cover photo here, I'll back out here so you can see this. The cover photo here is really showing how the rich people were being held up by the poor and the working class, and we'll get to that in later lessons. Today we're going to specifically start talking about life in the West and the middle of the country. Before we start talking about the massive amount of people that move out to the middle of the country, become farmers, and provide America with an epic level food source, we need to talk about something, because I can't, in good conscience, discuss this and not mention the treatment of the Native Americans. Now, if you have had me for my civics class, we have talked about this in depth. So if you've had me in civics, we have clearly gone through the different groups of people and the way they've been affected throughout society. But in case you haven't, I do need to hit the high points here, so you're not going into this blind with the belief, as it was presented to the American people, that all this land in the middle of the country was just wide open and empty, free for the taking. It wasn't originally like that. So what happened was the United States, there's millions of Native Americans here. Let's start with that. The United States, as they're spreading west, wanted to assimilate the Native American population into the United States. Assimilation technically means both cultures merge together and create a new culture, but really what America wanted was just for the Native Americans to be like America. The Native Americans had lived their own way for thousands of years, weren't just going to abandon the way they've done things forever. So it led to conflicts between the Native Americans and the United States, especially with the gold rush. Once settlers started moving on to Indian territory, like in the Black Hills and things like that, looking for gold, it caused conflicts between the Native Americans and the settlers. In large part because Native Americans in the middle of the country, they eat buffalo. They follow the buffalo. These massive herds of buffalo existed in America, and Native Americans would follow them. Well, that is why the Native Americans live where they do. That's where the buffalo are. When gold is discovered in the same areas as the buffalo, Native Americans are very protective of their food source, rightfully so. So it leads to armed conflict. The United States military gets involved. A thing called Custer's Last Stand takes place, where Native Americans actually defeat a United States group of soldiers, and then the United States has to go into the middle of the country and deal with the problem, aka try to annihilate a group of people. Native Americans are very good on horseback, and you couldn't catch them. So what the United States does after the Civil War to eliminate the Native American issue is they bring out the Gatling gun. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, I know where this is going. They turn around and Gatling gun and machine gun all the Native Americans. They don't do that, probably because they couldn't catch them, because the Native Americans move as a society extremely quick, because that is how they kept up with the buffalo. So what the United States does is completely slaughters the buffalo. This picture here is with just, I don't know what number of buffalo skulls that is, but completely eradicated the buffalo in the middle of the country. Almost made them extinct. There are very few left after this. So by destroying the Native American food supply, you ruin their entire way of life. So they forced the Native Americans to move onto these reservations in which they were treated absolutely horribly. Mainly because, if nothing else, the buffalo don't live on these reservations, which was like land set aside for the United States by the United States government for the Native Americans. Not only are they treated really badly on these reservations, there are multiple atrocities that took place. Wounded Knee is probably the most famous, where Native Americans start doing a religious ceremony called a ghost dance, and the soldiers like open fire on them because they don't understand their religion, and it's just an absolute slaughter at Wounded Knee. There's the Sand Creek massacre. There are multiple just absolute atrocities that take place at the reservations, and there's the dead bodies up of Native Americans at these reservations and move off. There's really not a real silver lining here with the treatment of Native Americans at this point in history. And while honestly in the scope of a survey course of the United States history, it's not really part of this. We talk a lot about it in civics and the treatment of the federal government's interaction with individual peoples. But I didn't want to just jump in here and lead people to believe, by my lack of acknowledging this, that the middle of the country was just a wide open territory free for the taking, which is exactly what it's getting ready to be, because all the Native Americans have been removed from the middle of the country in an absolutely horrific a way of doing things. So the question here is, explain how the discovery of gold and the spread of settlers into native land directly connects to the decision to murder the vast majority of the buffalo in the United States by the U.S. government. Misspelled United with 2 E's in it. And anyway, don't judge me on my typos. All right, so answer that completely. We're moving on. So, now that there's all this empty land in the middle of the country, the United States wants to spread out into the center of the country. Now, this is a little different than Manifest Destiny, which is like explore, plant your flag, like own it. There is a more specific reason for this. The United States government has been welcoming, and let me get here to a picture here, and we're going to come back to this picture here in a second, have been welcoming immigrants into the United States in droves from Europe, in large part because there's a lot of factory work. Now, the issue that the United States government sees on the horizon is, with all these people coming into the United States, food will eventually be a concern. You have to be able to feed all these people. So most countries struggle with food, of having enough food. That actually ends up not being a major issue in the United States, specifically because of this thing that happens at this time called the Homestead Act. The United States government, because keep in mind, all these dark blue areas on the map, this is now open land because the Native Americans and like the Sioux Indians had been moved off of them. They are going to give land to any American who wants it. 160 acres to be exact. 160 acres of land to anybody that wants it. Now keep in mind, a lot of people come in here that are immigrants from other countries. One of the things that's happening in Europe that forces people out of Europe is you can't own land in Europe. It's this whole concept of primogeniture, which has been taking place for a long time. There's just not available land, and it's really hard for people to find land to have. Now the United States government is just giving this land away. Not selling it, giving it away. Why would the United States government do this? Well, there's a handful of reasons. First, the land is free for the United States because they just took it from the Native Americans. It doesn't really cost them anything. The only stipulation to move out here on the Homestead Act and get your 160 acres of land is you have to promise to farm on it. So you have to be a farmer, and you're going to be growing food. So the United States government knows if they give land away, people will take advantage of it, and then they're going to move out and they're going to be farmers. This is going to solve the possible food issue with the growing population in the United States in the future. All right. Not only will it solve the food problem for the growing population at that level, there's really not going to ever be, up to present day, a concern about food in the United States because we have all this land that we hope people will grow food on. Now, slavery has ended. So this kind of brings the second reason why the United States government wants to do this, not necessarily connected to slavery, but without slavery, people that are going out here and taking this land, you either got to hire workers or do it yourself, which people who are taking free land aren't usually the wealthiest of the people, so they're having to do the work themselves. If you're working in a factory making a nickel a day, you might have one kid, maybe two, but you can't afford more than that. You move out to 160 acres where you got a farm, hello, 9 and 10 kids. And the United States government actually wants that. The United States government at this time wants the population to get larger. Not only does a larger population give more legitimacy to the young United States, but it also gives you a bigger tax base. More people that you can tax because they will grow up, they will work, and then you can tax them. So it increases the population. It gets plenty of food. There's a lot of reasons the United States wanted the Homestead Act. So they gave these land out in perfect squares in the middle of the country. So it's called the Great Plains. So if you move out in the middle of the country, most likely it's just a wide open field. Farm. You may be an immigrant from Ireland that has never seen a farm before, and you worked in a factory and you move out here, but you now have 160 acres of land. You don't know how to farm, but you have 160 acres of land you're expected to farm on. We're going to talk about how that specific situation gets remedied at the time. But if there are trees or anything here, you would immediately just cut them down because you want to maximize your 160 acres of land because, growing stuff, the more you grow, the more money you make. So 160 acres are given to anybody that took advantage of this, including freed slaves. This is, there's a lot of trash we're going to talk about the United States government treatment of minorities throughout the history. This one, good on you, America. They gave the land, 160 acres of land, to any Native Americans, we'll talk about that as well, to any freed slave that wanted it, any African American, regardless of race. You had to farm out here. Now, most African Americans that took advantage of this, they're going to refer to as exodusters. They're from the book of Exodus, where the slaves were freed from Egypt and found the promised land. So these are slaves that were given 160 acres of land if they took advantage of it, moved out to the middle of the country. They know how to farm. So most freed slaves and African Americans that move out to the middle of the country aren't actually going to be growing food. They will be growing cotton because that is a skill set they already had. So this is a picture of some of the exodusters that had moved out and took advantage of this. This ends up being extremely successful. Free land giveaway. So much so that they try to do it to the Native Americans. And I do think that this thing called the Dawes Act, D-A-W-E-S, the Dawes Act was probably a legitimate attempt by the United States government in order to provide Native Americans with sustainable land. Once again, bring them into that assimilation process, have them be farmers just like everybody else. So after all the best land was given away in the Homestead Act, the remaining land, because America has tons of land at the time, was given to Native Americans in this concept called the Dawes Act. So Native Americans took the land. The problem is Native Americans, while they had no concept of land ownership because they followed the buffalo, then they were put on reservations. When you give them land, it's again not part of their culture to own a piece of land. Like, the land is for everybody. You don't own land. So once Native Americans were given this land, immediately there would be people called speculators that would show up and try to buy the land from them for like $5. If the Native Americans spent $0 on it, and then some guy was trying to offer you $5 for the thing you spent $0 on, it was not uncommon for Native Americans to immediately sell their land and realize this is an easy way of making money. But by doing so, what happens is the United States government feels like we gave them land. We don't have to worry about them anymore. And very quickly, because again, their society is very different than ours, their land gets bought from them very quickly, and the amount of land held by Native Americans drastically reduces at the time. So you can see from 1850 to 1865 to 1880, and then all the way up here to 1990, how much land is owned by Native Americans throughout the process of reservations, Dawes Act, and things such as that. So the question here is, explain how the Homestead Act, where land was just given away to people for free was beneficial for the United States in at least two different ways. So we talked about why the United States would do this and how it benefits the United States to do this. So explain in at least two different ways of how this benefits the United States. So pause me, answer that. We're moving on. So, as I mentioned, these, Irish immigrants that working in the factories move out into the middle of the country. They have no idea how to farm. All right, because you're in the straight up wilderness in the middle of nowhere. They're used to city life where you can have stuff in the city, the things function in the cities, and you move out to the middle of nowhere to farm. Keep in mind, Native Americans had lived in this region for thousands of years, and they did not farm. All right, they followed the buffalo. Native Americans didn't farm, and it never became a thing in the middle of the country, in large part because there is not consistent rainfall in the middle of the country. And you need consistent watering in order to raise crops. That's a big reason the Native Americans have never grown food there. The United States government feels pretty confident they've figured a solution to this, but you have to teach these new people moving out there how to farm. So the United States government creates this thing called the Moral Land Grant Act, which gives land to the states where people are moving out, the Homestead Act, in order to build colleges, in order to teach these homesteaders that have moved out there due to the Homestead Act how to farm. So some of the things that they taught them, one of the very first things is, how do you build a house? On the East Coast, when people showed up here, you make a log cabin. Cool. Guess what you need for a log cabin? Logs. This is the Great Plains because it's just wide open flat as far as you can see. There are no trees. So how do you build a house? Well, they taught them how to make the things called soddies, which is basically a dirt house. I would imagine it's more clay-like. It's a little more sturdy than just making mud pies, stacking them on top of each other. But one of the first things they have to teach them out here is how to build a house, and they would build these things called soddies. So you can see here from this map on the Moral Land Grant Act, these colleges, and like Nebraska University. This is one of the very first ones. Any of the ones have a red dot, and is basically most of the states, like state colleges here, were built almost immediately when people started moving out here at the Homestead Act. Like Nebraska, their mascot is the Cornhuskers. So a lot of these colleges' goal is to teach people who've moved out due to the Homestead Act how to actually grow stuff. Which brings us back to this picture. All right, I told you we'd come back to it. So the big problem is, okay, you can teach me how to farm. I need rain. It doesn't rain consistently in the middle of the country. There's enough water because when it rains heavily, but it's not consistent rain for crops. So there's plenty of water like underground. The United States had figured this out. Basic modern agricultural techniques that they teach to the farmers. So you're not going to rely on rain in the middle of the country. You just need groundwater. So they create windmills. Windmills have been around for a while. And windmills, obviously, big thing here on the left. And it spins. And that activates a pump and pumps water out of the ground. Because deep in the ground, there's plenty of water. You pump it out. You put it in these reservoirs. And then you water your crops with those reservoirs. So by using the windmill extensively in the middle of the country, there is no water problem. Another thing is the steel plow. And we will discuss the Bessemer process here in this unit as well, in which steel, which is a highly valuable commodity and it's really hard to make, becomes really easy to make with this thing called the Bessemer process. And the steel plow is like lifetime warranted. It was much lighter than an iron plow, much more durable than a wooden plow, and very easily helped till up the fields here in the middle of the country. So the steel plow, the windmill, made life much easier. Little side note, the very first steel plow created by a guy named John Deere, which the lawn tractor or the industrial tractor company John Deere is named after, and the actual John Deere guy got to start by making a plow out of steel. Because early bird gets the worm. Now, you might if you're imagining doing this and you're like, yeah, it's cool and all, but I don't know if I want to pack up and move out in the literal middle of nowhere and give up all the stuff in the city. Well, there's a company called Sears and Roebuck, usually just called Sears, and they were around for a long time. They have just recently, with it since the 21st century, gone out of business. But Sears is like a big department store, like your Walmart type thing, where it has everything that you want. Well, Sears is the first one to realize, I bet there's a bunch of people in the middle of the country who might be 1,000 miles from our nearest store that would like to buy stuff from our store. So they create a catalog, and they would mail it to all the people in the middle of the country. And you could flip through this catalog, and if there's something that you wanted to buy, and it's all the stuff they have in their stores, you just cut it out, mail it in with some money, and they will mail it back to you, whatever product it is. And you could get like anything you could imagine from this catalog. This is like the Amazon of the 1800s. By doing so, you could basically have like a city lifestyle with all the same stuff that people had in the cities living in the middle of the country. So the Sears catalog becomes really influential in history because it encourages a lot of people who don't want to give up like modern life to go rough it in the middle of the country, the ability to go rough it in the middle of the country very easily because you don't have to really give up anything. So the question here is, describe some of the techniques and resources that farmers use to survive and thrive on the Great Plains, and explain how they are able to learn these techniques. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. Well, there ain't nothing more American than cowboys. Well, so cowboys, they were basically Mexicans, all right? So here on the left, that's a cowboy. On the right here, that is a vaquero, which is Spanish for cowboy. So it's Texas, right? Because remember, Mexico owned Texas for a long time, so the people were doing the same thing. And then when America took over Texas, the same people just changed their names to cowboys. So what do cowboys do? Oh, they shoot them out, pow, 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 pow. That's all Hollywood stuff. What cowboys actually do is they march cows from one location to a slaughterhouse where the cows are cut up and then shipped all over the country. Now, so that's what cowboys did. So when I'm saying cow, you're probably imagining this thing, all right? This is a cow. This is an Eastern cow. These are common in Europe. The problem is these cows are really stubborn. Cattle farmers aren't super rich. So if you get a bunch of cows, you got to have a fence to keep them in. So unless you're going to build like a brick fence, all right, these cows are just going to knock it down. Just like a little dinky wood fence, and then you're struggling to find them. Because of that, very few people actually had these type of cows around the country. And these cows aren't naturally in America. They're in Europe naturally. So the cows that America has naturally that don't need a fence are these in Texas called the Texas, wait for it, the Longhorns. Because they have long horns. Anyway, these cows naturally live in Texas because they will only eat the grass that's in Texas because they're weird. All right. These are the cows that people want to eat. All right. People start realizing pork might be bad for you at the time. There's a demand for these cows. All right. Also, as we're talking about cows, this right here, this is a dairy cow. These cows are used for milking, and not until they get really old do they get turned into burgers. But anyway, so the Texas Longhorns, all right, they live down here in the red area, all right. People all over the country want to eat these cattle. The problem is you can't slaughter them here in Texas and then ship them around the country because by the time they get there, because there's so many changeovers, there's not a lot of train tracks in Texas, all the meat has gone bad. So what they actually have to do is the cowboys have to march these big dumb animals from Texas all the way up here. I mean, it keeps going from where this map is all the way up to Chicago. All right. To a slaughterhouse there where they're slaughtered and then shipped off all over the country. It is very difficult to do. All right. This lasts about 15 years. And this is where the whole era of cowboys is. And then an invention comes out called barbed wire that's going to change everything. It's just wire with little pointy pricks on it. That's all it is. But it's going to fundamentally end this whole cowboy era because barbed wire does a handful of things that's going to end what's called the open range system. Open range system is where these cattle just walk around and then get herded up by cowboys and taken across the country. Number one, barbed wire can keep the other cows, the ones from Europe. You can now just easily and cheaply keep them hemmed in. You don't have to get the Texas Longhorn cattle now. You can have them much closer to your home area. All right. So barbed wire basically helps end the open range first by allowing you to have cows everywhere. You don't just need the Texas ones. Limits the need for cowboys if you don't have to have the Texas cows. Number two, due to the Homestead Act, remember I said they gave out those squares in perfect 160 squares? All right. It keeps animal and deer and stuff out from coming in and eating your corn and these other things that you are growing. So all the homestead farmers surround their property in this barbed wire. So now cows and other animals can't get in to eat their crops. But if you're trying to march all these animals from Texas across the country, the entire center of the country, where all these homesteaders are, all their property is blocked off with barbed wire, and there's not actually a path through. So that is the second way that barbed wire ends open range system, is even if you wanted to keep marching them across the country, you can't because there's not a path through the middle of the country. And then the final end to the cowboy era was the refrigerated railroad car, which is exactly what it sounds like, just like railroad cars that are cold. So you can now slaughter the cattle in Texas, put it on a railroad car, and you can ship it wherever you want around the country, and it doesn't go bad. So they obviously had to, and we're going to talk about some railroads. They had to blast holes. It was a big, intricate thing once these refrigerated railroad cars come out. Here's more of the trains that would be refrigerated railroad cars through the mountainsides of the United States trying to ship these cattle around the country. So the question here is, explain how the introduction of barbed wire ended the era of the American cowboy. You can also explain to me how refrigerated railroad cars also ended that, because, again, refrigerated railroad cars, you don't have to march them anywhere. You can slaughter them in Texas, and you can ship them around the country in the refrigerated railroad cars, and they wouldn't even go bad until they got there, completely negating the need for cowboys. So the whole cowboy era in the United States, it's really mainly a Hollywood thing, and it only lasted a handful of years. But since we're talking about railroads were in high demand, not surprising. And as people are moving out west, there is clearly a need to create what is called a Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad that will connect both sides of the country. So you can go all the way across the country. And we're going to be able to create this in the late 1800s. All right. Now you need a ton of workers for the Transcontinental Railroad. Who the United States gets is going to be a lot of Chinese workers. So you have to build it from the East Coast heading west. So there's a lot of Irish immigrants that are working in factories that would rather go do manual labor. So a lot of people come in to build the Transcontinental Railroad from the west, or from the east, moving west. They're also going to build it from the west coming east. Well, there's not a lot of people there. So the United States government encourages Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants, to flood into California at the time in order to start working on this Transcontinental Railroad so you can have tons of labor. So the Chinese Americans, the Chinese that come into the United States that were requested to come in by the United States, are immediately given jobs working on the railroad. And it is brutal work. Tons of people died. There's not really housing because you are just keep moving forward every day. But Chinese, they're having to go through mountains. It's incredibly dangerous. But Chinese immigrants were very influential in building the Transcontinental Railroad. And you can see here in this map that the red part is what the Chinese built, and then the blue part is what a lot of the Irish and ex-Civil War soldiers built, which is not nearly as mountainous. But what's interesting is at the very end, when they meet, we have a Transcontinental Railroad. And this is everybody high-fiving. There's a couple things here from this picture. You see any Chinese in this picture? And I'll move out of the way here. There's not, because as soon as the Transcontinental Railroad is complete, on the West Coast, there's all the Chinese immigrants go back to, there's no other jobs. See, the Irish, they can go back and work in the factories on the East Coast. On the West Coast, the only job the Chinese had was building this Transcontinental Railroad. As soon as the Transcontinental Railroad ends, there is very much backlash to the Chinese immigrants on the West Coast because they're fighting for jobs, and there's a lot of racism and discrimination that gets geared towards Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in general on the West Coast as soon as the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. Not even that. What the railroads are really important, obviously, because you can travel. Time becomes really important at the time. So every time you're just like, oh, it's noon, and everybody's kind of had their own time. Once the railroads come out, it is important to have an accurate time so you know when trains are on the tracks and they don't run into each other. And then they realize the sun doesn't come up, because the earth is round, the sun doesn't come up on the East Coast the same time it comes up on the West Coast. And once you can travel really fast on transcontinental railroads, they realize there is a need for time zones. And so the United States actually divides up into different time zones. That's why the time on the East Coast present day is actually 3 hours off of the time on the West Coast, so that noon is pretty much the same everywhere across the country. Feel like the sun's in the top of the sky at noon. So the question here is, explain how the Transcontinental Railroad's construction led initially to a demand for Chinese immigrants in the United States, then led to considerable backlash to Chinese immigrants once work completed. So pause me, answer that completely. I'll see you guys tomorrow.